But first of all, I just want to say how much I really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to be here. I've only been to India one time before, actually 5 years ago, and actually also at the behest of STEPS. That was a tour that we rather grandiosely called the Knowledge Society Tour in 2009. But my experience on this occasion, shorter unfortunately, but nevertheless very intense, has been just like it was on that occasion, which is just a fantastically rich, not just a learning experience, but a human experience. I really appreciate that, and I just want to express my thanks. And I'm almost in tears in saying that. So thank you very much to the Centre, to Dinesh and your colleagues here at JNU, and also to STEPS, Melissa, Ian, Andy, and the whole team for this centre, for this collaboration. It is a genuine North-South collaboration, listening and learning going both ways, and that is something which is exemplary. So, long may it continue and may it develop yet further. I'm the least qualified here, I feel, to be giving a final panel presentation, a cross-cutting panel, was it we were called? I'm probably the least travelled, the least experienced of anybody in the room in South World countries. But that being said, I guess one of the ways in which I can just feel the kind of solidarity genuinely is because after quite a long history now in academic scholarly study of science and technology and its social and its historical and its philosophical dimensions and its normative dimensions, I feel that actually I'm living in the problem, and the problem in that sense is the North World and the models of development and of welfare which its own intellectual beings have provided for the world. So in that sense I feel like I'm at least in the heart of the problem, and the responsibility of lifting the burden, as it were, and trying collectively to find the ways of doing that is just as necessary, potential, and possible in my own world, even if I'd never stepped out of the UK itself. So that's where I see my own struggle, if you like, is not to race around the world studying everyone suffering on the receiving end of multinational corporations, the World Trade Organization, and other Western-driven institutions or North World-driven institutions, but to actually fight from the inside, as it were. That being said, I want to begin my comments and reflections here with a reference to the presentation yesterday, but it was part of the presentation on uncertainty from above and below, and the photo voice presentation on the Sundaravans by Shiboyi Bose. No voice except the photo voice, and yet for me the most powerful presentation of my whole very rich experience of the presentations and discussions and exchanges here. That for me brought a real sense of the vulnerability and the suffering and the endurance as well, the sheer endurance of the people who were in that presentation. Brought it together with analysis which brings what is invisible and forgotten usually and often deliberately forgotten, not always, brought that to view in a way that was really, really powerful and really inspiring. And also, of course, that analysis, starting from there, is also pointing to, systematically, towards better possibilities. And we might say that that photo voice case is the hardest case, certainly one of the hardest cases that we confront. But nevertheless, to have that kind of collective analytical force is the only thing we've got, and it's very inspiring. When I say the only thing that we've got, it's an awful lot, and we should build and celebrate it. That presentation reminded me of an article which I read quite a long time ago, which I still go back to regularly, by the Danish anthropologist Kirsten Hastrup, called Hunger and the Hardness of Facts, published in the anthropological journal Man about early 90s, I think, early mid-90s. And one of the things, the question she posed at the beginning of that article was really, how do we, as social scientific scholars studying human situations in various global situations, how do we actually cope with the experience? And how do we communicate the experience of actually studying situations where people are suffering? How do we communicate that, and how do we deal with it in what is supposed to be an emotion-free, objective, disinterested, analytical spirit? And what was really important about what she said, in what I took away from the article and what I put in front of students as often as I can, is that she pointed out that there is a crucial need we should never forget for a moral imagination, which is actually driving and inspiring our analytical effort. So the analysis and the normative commitment are not disconnected, but the one is driving the other. And several people, including my fellow panelists just now, have said the same thing, referring to one source of that kind of inspiration for me. And it's also something which we should remember is a proper and a necessary situation, a condition of doing good science, including good climate science for a better world, a more secure world, a more just world. And it's something which, of course, we've been systematically denied, that kind of debate, because that is then defined as being anti-science, anti-rationality, all that kind of thing. And I think we ought to maintain the insistence that that is not the case, that we can actually do good science with a moral imagination which is inspiring and driving it. Absolutely right. So, we get towards some of that science. One of the things that I've been struck by, and it's come up a few times during the last 2 days during the symposium, is that there's a sense in which, or a tendency for us always to project the catastrophe, the apocalypse, the disaster, into the future. And I'm reminded actually of something which is said about the philosopher Martin Heidegger, that he is said to have had a note on his desk with the question, perhaps the apocalypse has already happened, ? And I think, I'm now thinking about the Sundarabans and the photo voice. That for me is the apocalypse having already happened. And those kinds of human situations, where in a world of increasing inequality, increasing injustice, let's not forget that actually there we have the human apocalypse already here. And one of the key things which this does, I think, is it forces us and encourages us to rethink the distributions of responsibility. It sounds absurd to say that. Here we are, very comfortably existing, interacting, having a great symposium, and taking away lots of important and rich and empowering thoughts. Nevertheless, we're living in an apocalypse. And that's worth reflecting upon. And here I want to also support Andy in his observations about the subversive benefits of reflexivity in these kinds of things, because these are challenges that come right back home to each of us. So another thing I think about the idea that the apocalypse is somewhere in the future, whether it's tomorrow or whatever the projections might say, whichever projection we might read or hear, that it also induces thoughts about planetary limits. When or how or to what extent might we have crossed them at some point in the future, and so on. And I remember actually Harvard, the home of STEPS at least, Sprue and Andy's home was actually one of the most thoroughgoing critics of the original limits to growth of the MIT systems engineers, Dennis Meadows, Jay Forrester and co. In 1971, the Club of Rome Studies, as it's often called. Planetary limits, I find it's an ambiguous kind of idea. And I'm actually thinking about something which was produced not long after that, the limits to growth exchanges, and the Sprue critiques of the Meadows-Forrester study. There's a book which is, I wonder whether anybody here would tell me they know it, they're familiar with it, and they see its relevance to our concerns. Fred Hirsch, in about 1975, I don't remember the precise year, the social limits to growth. And Hirsch wasn't actually talking in our terms about development models and issues, but he was talking about social limits to growth. And we need to think about that in relation to our concerns about sustainability and justice. The IPCC climate scenarios, as they're called, are interesting in these respects, I think, in terms of limits and in terms also of prediction and risk assessment and the discussion that there's been here about uncertainties and how we understand them. The IPCC, in its climate projections, has probably been one of the more progressive scientific bodies in terms of actually how we handle uncertainty. It's been issuing systematic guidance to its authors for a long time now on how you actually express and represent uncertainty in the documents that the IPCC produces. And what's interesting about this is that although it's actually been progressive in that sense, it's remained within the bracket in terms of the knowledge and its capacity to actually understand the system that we're actually interfering with, the climate system, and everything that follows from that. But actually it's implied that it's manageability, and in that sense it's controllability. And you might say now, 2014, with the 5th assessment report halfway out, with the Working Group 1 report already published, and the 2 and 3 about to be published in the next couple of months, we've actually got the opportunity now in 2014 to actually evaluate the projections of the first report in 1990 against actual outturns. How did those predictions actually look against reality? And those predictions, insofar as we can call them predictions, they were wrong. So were they made up then? As, of course, the climate deniers would like to say, they're just making it up. Well, actually, it's important to remember that the IPCC was wrong in the sense that they actually underestimated the outturns. They didn't overestimate them or even make them up. They underestimated them. The glaciers are melting far faster than any projections which were made in 1990 by the IPCC. So the uncertainties in those models, although they've been used quite deliberately by the climate deniers to say there's no problem, we don't need to restrict carbon emissions, we can burn as much coal, oil and anything else as we like and consume. that actually those uncertainties point in the other direction too. That actually maybe they're pointing us in the direction that things could be a lot worse than those IPC scenarios are actually telling us. And that's something which is often lost in that debate about uncertainties and climate predictions or projections. So, actually one of the first critics of the IPCC first report was actually from Delhi, Centre for Science and Environment. Their critique was effectively an ethical critique of the framing of that report. Basically the argument being that, well, we've actually emitted too much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, so now we should control them, and we'd better take that control and just equal the responsibility, or equalise the responsibility around the globe. And the Centre for Science and Environment pointed out that actually the responsibility for the historical accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the global warming was already actually in the climate system and going to come out. Whatever we did to greenhouse gases in 1990, we did nothing. In fact, we just let them increase. But the point is that they were pointing out that there was actually a responsibility greater on the industrial world to actually control emissions than to project those emissions controls onto developing societies like India. So they were posing another issue about climate, which is something that Mike Hume has written on very eloquently and very searchingly, I think. The question of how do we frame the problem? And whose problem definition is it that has allowed us to think of climate as a problem only of carbon, and only of carbon economies and carbon markets and all those kinds of things. And this leads me to the point that actually, if we think of the IPCC scenarios as effectively risk assessments, in all but name, which is what they are, when you look at the IPCC reports and the executive summaries for policymakers and so on, they're full of, and indeed all of the guidance on uncertainty, is full of the attempt to define likelihoods of those scenarios. So they're attempting to interject probabilities into those scenarios for policymakers, which is what risk assessment does. Consequences of harmful events, product of that and its probability. That's risk in scientific terms. So, as Andy and I have pointed out in various writings, in particular the collaboration that we did with the European Environment Agency in 2002, Late Lessons from Early Warnings, the Precaution Principle in the 20th Century, of which there is now a second volume. We won't go into the story as to why we didn't appear in the second volume. That's probably best done over a late night beer or something. But one of the points that we've made about risk assessment is that actually if you do risk assessment in a seriously rigorous scientific way, then you inevitably reach beyond uncertainty into ignorance, indeterminacy, and ambiguity. By ambiguity, we mean, what is the framing of the problem? What's the meaning of the issue to which we're actually attaching the term risk? Risk is value-laden right from the very start. It's a risk to something from something. And if it's a risk to something that we're concerned about, we're valuing it. That is already normative value commitment in the very science of risk assessment. It doesn't mean to say that from there you can't do perfectly rigorous risk assessment. But one of the things that you do if you're rigorous about that is you acknowledge the conditions under which that knowledge of the risk was generated. Very often it's artificial, laboratory-controlled studies which don't tell us as much as we ought to know about the real-world conditions under which people, or anything else we might value, are actually exposed to the risks. So, in other words, there's always a question about conditions. Those conditions vary. So, a rigorous approach to risk assessment leads us to acknowledge that conditionality, that variability, that lack of control, that lack of predictive control. Logically then, if you acknowledge that, as good science ought to be allowed to do, And actually good science does, but science for policy doesn't. Science as public authority, in other words, doesn't. It's not allowed to. Then, if we take that seriously, we're then led to the further logical question, which is, well, if we don't control the consequences of this particular innovation trajectory as much as we claim or thought we did, then you have to ask, so why are we doing it? What are the benefits from this innovation trajectory? What are the social purposes? What are the social needs that we're meeting? Whose needs are those? And if we meet those, whose are we neglecting? These are the questions which are systematically denied in the process of risk assessment. And yet it's become the kind of singular, exclusive threshold for social regulation. This is supposed to be about social regulation of technologies and innovation trajectory. And yet we've actually allowed ourselves to be deceived, I would say, into a process where we're asking a science which is controlled by a variety of forces that are not remotely democratic as the regulators of the products of those same scientific processes. So there's a systematic and quite deep, multi-layered process going on, which is about the framing of the issues and the way in which the meaning of the very issues that we're dealing with here is left to a science which is not open to inclusive deliberation over what question are we asking and why are we asking that question. What about the other questions which could be asked? No questions about alternative innovation trajectories, which is all of STEPS work on innovation and alternative innovation trajectories on diversity and distribution and direction enter in directly as salient terms that are neglected from the conventional frameworks. So the pathways approach is a really important, essential intellectual approach for actually getting a grip on these issues in a way that normal policy systems, including scientifically informed systems, don't at all get there. In fact, they systematically deny those openings. It's not that they just don't get there, it's that they're systematically excluding them. Very important distinction. And if we can say that risk is itself an ambiguous term and requires that kind of deliberative, inclusive debate as to what we mean by it, what questions are we led to ask for the scientists to try to answer with all the qualifications about the conditionality of their knowledge, then we're also led to sustainability and its framing. And there's been a lot of debate, of course, about that, a lot of rumination on how we deal with an effect, or how we find an effective definition of this term. But one thing which I think needs to be maybe added to that debate is something which is along the lines of what I just said about risk. And this was something that I was first led to in the 1990s when at Lancaster we did some work for the local authority actually on sustainability indicators. And they were pretty enlightened. They asked us as academics to do some public research involving citizens in Lancashire concerning their definition of what would be meaningful sustainability indicators to them as citizens, democratic citizens. One of the focus groups that we had, one of our respondents responded to the question that we were asking about this by saying they invent terms like that and then they just keep us in the dark. That's a very interesting response, that when you stop and puzzle over what was that respondent meaning, which we pursued a bit further in the focus group interaction. Basically what they were meaning was the term sustainability has been colonized by science, not necessarily deliberately, because actually policymakers are expecting science to provide the answer. What is sustainability? Oh, scientists can tell us that. So they'll tell us when we need to limit this or limit that or whatever. Until then, we can just keep rolling. So the point is that sustainability is itself it's an emergent term. It's ambiguous, essentially ambiguous, because the meaning of terms like this is not only a matter for science to actually objectively define and, as it were, reveal from nature. It's not that kind of term, in the same way that risk isn't actually. But what that means is that these processes have to involve civic engagement, not just as a one-off engagement event, but as a continual political process of negotiation of what this means. And it's a developing meaning. And it should be informed by scientific knowledge, of course it should. But it is not itself a scientific term. There's a distinction here which is often confused in the policy world between science informing policy on issues which have been defined by democratic processes, and science actually taking over the definition of what those democratic processes should be defining as public issues. So there's something that's really important there that I don't have time to elaborate on now, but I just want to return then to my last point, which is concerning the question of innovation. And it's something which a good friend of STEPS and IDS, Paul Richards, introduced quite a long time ago now again, in relation to the romanticisation which often occurs, and we recognise it, we see it very often, of the innovator from the bottom, if you like. The small farmer innovating through seed collection and exchange with neighbouring farmers and communities and so on, their own networks. That we often look at the accumulated knowledge of systems of traditional practice like that and say, where did they get that sensibility about sustainable innovation? And Paul pointed out that actually when we get on the ground with those farmers and look at what they're doing and listen to them, a lot of the time they're improvising. They're just improvising. And they're improvising with an ethical and cultural framework which may be very different from ours. But nevertheless, the innovation process itself actually is an improvisation process, not a planning process. And this is in the spirit of the observation which Andy just made about it's almost like an inculcated instinct that we now have, that we expect to be able to design things like sustainability or security or justice even into these systems when they're ongoing, relentlessly ongoing and emergent, ever emergent kinds of properties and conditions, which is why the democratic process is not something that can be defined by public engagement with science, as it often has been, as a one-off event where we go and ask the people and they give us an answer. It's a rather weak, rather inadequate version of that, what is at stake here. Something else I wanted to say, which I just want to return to and then drop it. Yeah, temporality. Something which has been raised but hasn't been really dwelt upon, and I think it's a really important question that we haven't sufficiently considered in this symposium. But I just want to reiterate my thanks, and hopefully